to talk a little bit more about the exchange. So I talked about the fact that from our arteries, we're able to push through this plasma, and plasma is interstitial fluid. When it gets out into our tissue, then it's called interstitial fluid. It's called plasma when it's inside of our arteries. And then those capillaries are just large enough to keep the red blood cells and things like that, the larger items in our bloodstream, from coming out. So plasma really is our blood without the red blood cells. And then due to the pressure on the outside of the artery and the pressure on the inside of the artery, that's going to allow things to come out. But when we're in an inflammatory state, what happens is those valves, those capillaries, which aren't valves, well, I guess technically they're a valve, they open up wider and they allow a lot more fluid to come out than normally would. And the picture that you're seeing on the screen in the green is a lymphatic, is the end of the lymphatic vessels. And these are very small. There's a function there to withdraw the excess fluid that's not needed anymore. And in this particular picture, you see those little cells that are in the middle. Those would be your adipose or your fat cells. And so we're talking about, we're talking about these outer layers, the superficial adipose layers and the deeper adipose layers that have fat cells in them. Then that's what I'm really showing in the picture. But this story plays out in all parts of our body, in almost every part of our body, including your organs and inside your heart and inside the layers of things, even have their own interstitial space. Anytime you start hearing interstitial space or blood moving through a space, your arteries, your cardiovascular system moves through a space and then allows fluid to move out into the space, it's still an interstitial space, no matter what they call it. And then it has to be withdrawn by the lymphatic system to maintain the hydrostatic pressure, to maintain volume within that space correctly. When too much fluid happens and comes out to the space, when more fluid goes out than can be withdrawn, then you have problems. You have edema. You have localized edema, which spreads out and gets further and further out until it causes many conditions and diseases. So on this next slide, I'm just getting closer into those intake valves for the lymphatic system. And this is one of the most important concepts to understand about what happens with our body when things go wrong. In our interstitial space, there's supposed to be these mechanisms to allow a backup system. Like when I was growing up, I had, in my house, there was a big problem with flooding in our basement. We were in a low-lying area, and we had a sump pump that would pump any water that would accumulate or seep through the walls of our basement. And that sump pump was pretty good for a while. And then, you know, when we'd have really rainy weather or a large volume of rain, that sump pump would quickly get overwhelmed. And then there would be a secondary pump if that one failed. So what happens with these lymphatic vessels is at the very ends of them, in the intake part of it, they're very small. They're cell size, as you can see. They're the size of, you know, they're the same circumference as the diameter of our fat cells. They're very, very small. And then there's valves within, there's intake valves there. Those intake valves are supposed to open up based off of pressure of the fluid on the outside and the inside, and they just bring in that fluid. And they're built in a certain way that when there's too much fluid pressure in that area, those valves are actually tethered to our fascia fibers. So as the space within there starts to expand out because there's more fluid, those valves will open up wider because they're actually wired to and tethered to those fibers that are running across, those collagen fibers, and fascia is what we call it. So when the fascia fibers spread apart, the valves open up further, and it's just a way to bring in more fluid, which would be the opposite effect of inflammatory, which means open up the capillaries and bring more fluid into the tissue. The same thing is supposed to happen to the lymphatic system to widen those valves out to bring more fluid into the interstitial space. or excuse me, into the lymphatic space from the interstitial space. And then, of course, we call it lymph once it gets inside that space. The problem that we have here is, and this is probably the one thing that gets misunderstood and doesn't get considered in a lot of conditions, and of course pain and mobility as well, is that when the fluid pressure gets too much, that lymphatic intake system gets compressed and those valves close. Once those valves close, all bets are off. So the problem is that you get, we have compartments inside of compartments inside of compartments, and this keeps going. We have layers and layers and layers of fascia and cells and things like that. So when this fluid is now apart from whatever is holding it in place, like our proteoglycan gel that's within that particular layer, the fatty layers, it has to get into another layer. It has to get out of those layers. When it stays within a bubble like that, then it's basically quarantined. It's compressed, and there's where you start to get some of your pressure that's pressurizing and pressing on your nerve endings and causing all kinds of problems. So if you've ever been in pain, you've ever felt and pressed down with your fingers and you start to feel a lump, a bump, oh, that definitely hurts right there. What you're feeling is fluid, too much fluid in that one space. And then you use maybe a method like putting heat on it, or massaging it, or going to a massage therapist, or physiotherapy, or you may use a heating pad with a little bit of vibration. Some of those methods work a little bit. What is missing, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the end, what's missing is the vibration to diffuse that fluid through those layers into a layer where the lymphatic system is not compromised already. By the way, the lymphatic system is one of the largest parts of your immune system. When you think of your immune system from another aspect, it is the biggest thing plays out, the biggest part of our immune system plays out in our interstitial space, because we have substances that get sent out to do certain things. The viruses and bacteria are within the interstitial space, and it stays within the interstitial space for a couple of reasons. It can't get into the lymphatic system, and so it gets transported to parts of our body through our blood system, or we may have it injected, or we may breathe it in, but it still gets transported to certain places. The inflammatory system starts up, too much fluid pressure gets in there, and then now the ability to pull that fluid into the lymphatic system, which has its own immune system process. That's one of the main purposes for our lymphatic system. Let's bring that fluid in. We have things that we can add to the mixture. We have lymph nodes that can clean the viruses. That's a big part of our immune system. When that shuts down, or even the transport capability to pull that virus-laden fluid out of your interstitial space, you can't fix it if you can't move it out of the space. It just stays there, and it's more and more fluid starts to build up. Our immune system gets kicked into its adaptive mode now, and even though things can get to it, then you have no way of removing it. If you ever lived in an area where you had a really bad blizzard, or maybe it's a really big flood, or you had the aftermath of a hurricane or a typhoon, you have a lot of flooding, and the ability to get help to the scene to help people out, that gets compromised once you have the routes of communication and the routes of transport get messed up, and that ends up being your lymphatic system. It gets closed down. Those valves get closed, and once the valves are closed in that system, the only thing that can happen is, if we can get the fluid away from its current, it's the thing that's holding it in, if we can get it to the next space, then maybe that lymphatic system can do something with it. So we have to consider those facts in our immune system. Our immune system, our lymphatic system, has valves. So once they get into the intake system, then they get moved up through, if let's say it's in our peripheral, it's in our arms and our legs, even the lymphatic system there, it pulls all that fluid in from our interstitial spaces, and it cleans it and brings it back up to our subclavian veins up here in our chest. And it's just a transport system, only it doesn't have the ability to have its own pump. Our movements, our muscle movements and us moving helps that lymphatic system pull or push that fluid to where it needs to go into our lymph nodes for cleaning these viruses and these bacteria and things like that. And then it still needs to move it further up so that fluid and all the pathogens that go along with it can actually be dealt with the correct way. So and then one of the things that we do first when we get sick and our immune system starts to be activated, what do? We lay down. That's one of the big things that's happening with the people that are having the hardest time with flu and colds and viruses, is that we lay down. And it only gets worse after that, because now your lymphatic system, if the fluids can get into the system and the viruses can be moved into your lymphatic system, now you've just reduced the ability for your lymphatic system to pump its fluid even more, because you've laid down or you've sat down or you've stopped moving. You get isolated, you get quarantined, you sit in your house all the time now so that you don't have contact with anybody else. When that happens, we stop moving. So that's one of the things that's a big concern is, your immune system is part of, your immune system cannot work the way that it needs to when you have too much fluid pressure and you stop moving. So those are definitely two big things to consider. We also have to consider, let's say that the symptoms, the things that we're having is bronchial related and lung related. Now I want to talk about, on this picture you have not only your throat all the way from the larynx down to your bronchial system, and notice how the bronchial system kind of branches out and it's embedded into our lungs. Where I'm going with this is not only how the inflammatory system kind of reduces our airway as things get inflamed. Remember, swelling, excess fluid, it's still the plasma, it's still the interstitial fluid, whether it's inside of a layer of a tube like our bronchial tubes, or it's in our larger spaces that is just underneath our skin. It's the same exact fluid and the same mechanisms are at play here. They're just called something different, and that leads a lot to the confusion. If we have bronchitis, then itis means inflammation. It means swelling. It means more fluid in those spaces. And we deal with it pretty much the same exact way. And then another reason I want to show the bronchial tubes and the way that they branch out, and they're going to go eventually into the lower part of our lungs, is that where those are located on the body. And at towards the end of this training, I'm going to show you where we would focus when we put our vibration on the body, whether it's something that's virally, you might have bronchitis, you might have pneumonia of the lungs, or you might have more chronic things. You might have an asthma attack, you might have COPD, those things. Where is the fluid? And that's really what we do within NEHC, is where's the fluid now, and where's the fluid causing the problems? And almost, I would say 99% of the time, it is a fluid related issue, which these viruses and the symptoms that go along with it are still a fluid related issue. And the challenge is that not a lot of people even understand that it's a fluid problem, or they even know how to do anything with it. Our response is usually to add more medication to it. If you look at some of the definitions of some of these symptoms, the cause of the excess fluid is medication. Which medication that is, who knows? But you're going to see this pattern play out quite often in our conditions, and we just wanted to show you what we're seeing when it comes to fluid. The next one is just a picture of the lungs, and that's really to focus on the fact that the bronchioles come down into capillaries, and then you have these alveoli where you get oxygen that's being transferred through these membranes into, well, we bring in oxygen and we transport it into our arteries so that we can have oxygen transported through there. Because remember, again, this is a movement over into a transport system, which is our blood. But when the bronchial tubes and our lungs, those alveoli, get filled full of fluid, it's the same exact reaction. It is the same interstitial fluid that gets forced out through these membranes. So that's all going to come into play. Also, if you're working with resolving these conditions, where is the fluid happening and why is it stuck where it is? So those are the things that you would focus on when you're trying to heal these things or resolve them or keep them from getting as bad as they are to what would ultimately lead to death or lead to permanent damage. Maybe it's not so permanent, but further damage based off of maybe you have pneumonia or fluid associated with the lungs, which I'll talk about a little bit more here in a minute. But we have the trachea, the bronchi, we have those tubes that are moving down. Where can we actually provide some comfort and some resolution to certain things involved with the bronchioles and the lungs themselves? So with the lung anatomy, here's just a different look at the lungs. On the left-hand side, you can see that the lungs are actually surrounded by our rib cage. Should be no surprise to you. We have the trachea and the bronchial tubes coming down from the throat into the lungs and branching out into the lungs. And then the bottom of our rib cage, that's really where our lungs extend down to. And what I'm going to focus on is the fact that there are bags within bags within bags within our body. The bags, or the things, our organs that get surrounded, is made with fascia as well. We call them membranes, but most of our things in our body are structured, including the inner structure of, let's say, our heart. It's fascial fibers, collagen fibers, that make up the structure of most of our body. And we have to consider that too, that the bag that surrounds our lungs is called the pleural bag, and there's a cavity in there. And this is what I'm going to focus on quite a bit when it comes to where does the fluid go when we have these runaway inflammatory swelling fluid just building up in certain places. So in this picture, again, it's more of a zoomed in look at our lungs, and what you're seeing on the edge of our lungs, the edges of the lungs, the lobes of the lungs, is a cross section of our ribs. So keep that in mind, is that our ribs and the muscles around and in between those rib bones, as things fill up with fluid, we're pressing against our rib cage. And even though our rib cage is there to protect us, our cavities and our organs that have been protected, when things go wrong and you have a buildup of fluid, things go even worse because it can't expand beyond a certain amount. So on the lower left-hand side, you see it looks like they're taking the edge of the lung and kind of expanding it out. Here's what I wanted to talk about. We have bags within bags. There's an outer wrapping of our lungs, and then there's another bag on the other side it's basically our lungs are double bagged. And in between the double bagging of our lungs, one bag is supposed to protect our lungs from the outside of it, not the outside, but basically the edge of our rib cage, and then the inside is supposed to protect the outer or the outside, or it's supposed to protect our lungs. Those two layers are supposed to slide against each other. As you take a breath, there's going to be an awful lot of sliding every time you breathe. So these layers have a cavity in between them, and this is called the pleural cavity. So there's a visceral pleura that is lining the lungs, and then there's the parietal pleura, which lines the chest wall. And in between them is the pleural cavity. Now, cavity, it has some fluid in it, and every time we talk about cavities, we should consider the fact that this is where fluid goes when there's too much. It's kind of, if it was a dam, the dams have spillways. If it rains too much, or you get too much snowfall from the mountains, and the river starts to fill up the dam too much, there's always these spillways that will spill down into these retention ponds, and that way the dam doesn't break. The same thing happens with our organs. We have cavities that we can have in the interstitial space, and they're special spaces that allows extra fluid to move into those spaces, and they're actually called potential spaces. And what that means is there's potential for interstitial fluid if the organ next to it can't take care of it. We have another backup system. It's these spaces like this, the pleural cavity. There's maybe 10 milliliters of fluid normally within this cavity, and that is probably because some of the interstitial fluid kind of fills up a little bit, but then the lining is actually called a serous membrane, and that has a constant serous fluid being secreted from the cells that are on the outer edge of these membranes. But then there's also our blood flow through it too. So our blood flow still provides interstitial fluid into this cavity. So when we're having an infection, when we're having viral problems, when we're having things going on inside of our lungs, we also have problems going on the outside of our lungs. A lot of times we think that our conditions are, when we talk about not being able to breathe, COPD, all those conditions, respiratory problems, some of it is bronchial related, some of it is some of it's bronchial related in the tubes, and then of course some of that ends up spilling out into our cavity, our pleural cavity. Some of it is related on the inside of our alveoli, in the inside of our lung lobes, and then some of the problem is on the outside as well. If most of the fluid, if the fluid fills up in our little alveolar, our little sacs, that can get filled with interstitial fluid as well. That's where we get emphysema, and we have the inability to transfer oxygen across the membranes. But then a lot of the problems with our lungs that we think is on the inside of the lungs is actually on the outside of the lungs. And that is where this pleural cavity is. When that fills up, it just keeps filling up. When the ability to pull, it's the same thing played out again now. When you're trying to pull that interstitial fluid out, when you get too much fluid, what's the backup? It is the backup. The pleural cavity is the backup to the lungs. When you get too much fluid in the lungs through inflammation and problems like that, it goes into the pleural cavity. When the pleural cavity starts to fill up, then you have a problem. Once the interstitial system, or excuse me, the lymphatic valves get closed up again, too much pressure, now it just runs away with too much fluid. You get things like pneumothorax, where if you were to have an accident or something, or get into an accident and have an actual injury, maybe you punctured the lung and fluid starts pouring into your cavity. When we talk about a collapsed lung, it's not that you puncture the lung and then the air goes out of the lung and it's now a balloon that's, deflated. It is the fluid pressure from the pleural cavity is pushing on your lung and forces the air out of it. So that's one of those commonly misunderstood processes in things like pneumothorax. It's fluid outside of the lungs pushing on it. A lot of the conditions that we have, let's say COPD, things that are on the outside, that are actually on the outside, infections, inflammation that's building up on the outside of our lungs. Those are pushing against our lungs, and here's where we're having problems. With these current viruses and the flu that goes along with it, one of the biggest things that they cannot resolve for whatever reason is there's just too much fluid buildup. The people that don't survive that type of virus, that flu virus, is they get pneumonia. The pneumonia moves that fluid into its escape route, the pleural cavity. Pleural cavity continues to fill up. When fluid is removed mechanically from the lungs, it's not always from inside the lungs that they're removing the fluid from. They're removing it from the pleural cavity. They're trying to remove it, and the fluid is moving in just as fast as it's going out. We have to protect our ability for our lymphatic system to do what it needs to. It is the immune system, but it's also the ability to remove these fluids, and we're basically drowning in our own fluid. We're suffocating from our own fluid. Inside of that pleural cavity, we're suffocating. People that have congestive heart failure, you can see that congestive is fluid in and around the heart. This is the same exact story played out in just a different organ. Even down in your abdomen, same thing. There's a fluid sac around all those things, and when that fills up, now you get all kinds of problems. That's going to be a different video, however. So on the right hand side, you see that one of those lobes from the lung on the right hand side, it's the cavity, it's the pleural cavity collecting more and more fluid. They call it pleural fluid. That's one of the things that I think that people get, where most of the things get misunderstood, is we keep calling our fluid something different depending on where it is. If we were to call this interstitial fluid, maybe we would react to it differently. So we know that things are building up on the inside of this pleural cavity. That's a big part of this story. And you can see here with the pneumothorax that I was just talking about, when air can actually start filling up that space along with the fluid itself. And you can see that when air and fluid starts to fill up that pleural cavity, it starts to push the air right out of the lungs.